All right, so I wanted to do I guess it'll be a semi-long vlog, but on why there seems to be like an inability for the disability community to come together, right? And this is also runs rampant through various um, political factions as well, right? Not just like communities focused on like certain kinds of like activism, right? All forms of activism run into this problem, and more so now than ever, right? And so the problem is that there's what we call an illusory community. Okay, so this is a Marxian concept. So if you don't like that, I don't give a shit. But Marx and Engels talk about like the illusory community, right? And they posit that the state is this, right? That it's this neutral arbiter that stands above society and represents society and a general interest. When of course, like in any given epoch, it will represent the interest of either the ruling class or the ruling force, um, in this case, capital, in society, right? And so, because Washington is the place where everyone goes for this, it it doesn't resolve any of the actual antagonisms in society, even though it posits itself as being again able to settle these disputes. Right? You go there, you lobby for your case, and voila, you get $10 million for funding for whatever Parkinson's research or something, and everyone goes does this, and then other people go like, well, why did they get $10 million? We only got $500,000 or nothing, you know, and so it does address these discrepancies at the level of representation, but not material reality. And what's the material reality? Well, we're all in competition with not just one another, but corporations, the state itself, right? And so these quote unquote political forms take on an independent power, right? And they actually wind up being fetters on those they claim to serve. This is why people are very disgusted with Washington, for example, right? This is why Congress has an extremely low approval rating, right? Because they're not working for you, right? They're not necessarily just working for the quote unquote elites either. They're working on behalf of the total social capital of the entire world at this point, all right? And that is antagonistic to your very narrow aims, right? No matter how important they are to you, okay? And so this causes fragmentation, right? Necessarily. Capital already does this, but then the state reifies it, okay? It makes it real, okay? And so even US disability policy, for example, right, invokes this sort of unified disability community in laws like the ADA and various funding rhetoric, right? Um, but in practice, right, it divides into sort of diagnostic silos, right? Autism advocates, MS groups, not MS at 13, I mean multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury lobbies, psychiatric coalitions, and so on, right? So each must pitch its own unique prevalence, burden, right? And then ultimately it's the ROI to Congress, right? What by investing in this, what is the American people going to get back? And most people try to make an economic case, right? There's and such amount of people out of work, and you're losing tax revenue, et cetera, and so forth, right? And so you need to earmark this amount of money for the NIH or the HHS or something like that. Designate this amount of waivers, this amount of grants, often through 501, 3Cs or something like that. These are nonprofits, right? And so they have to translate suffering into what you would call grant ready metrics, right? And it turns these representative groups into stakeholders, ostensibly, right? This is like a version of like stakeholder capitalism, right? And so again, this breeds competition over solidarity. Why? Because it turns potential allies into private rivals for this seemingly finite pot of federal dollars. Okay, like the developmental disabilities assistance and Bill of Rights Acts, or again, disease specific NIH institutes. All right, so groups and their nonprofits, right, highlights their distinctiveness, right, our underserved population, right, and you see this with when you see graphs about like look how little MECFS is getting, or people squabbling that somehow this group is because they happen to share overlapping conditions or non-specific um, symptomologies or something like that, or undefined symptomologies, that they're encroaching on our that finite pot, right? And they don't address the problem at where the common barrier is, which is the fact that we don't live in that society where we can actually be a community, right? And instead, we're turned into what much like the working class is turned into, right? Is this people fighting over, you know, jobs or resources or resource allocation, right? And so this is where we come into um, lobbying, for example, right? So lobbying integrates advocates and their 501(c)s, right, as stakeholders in the state's machinery, advisory panels, awareness months, parity fights, and then they have all this sort of like formal inclusion, grants and hearings, reinforces like these hierarchies, like well sort of like from the top down, like and those hierarchies are very well sourced illnesses, right, that are primarily pharma backed or spearheaded by some famous actor or something like that, or a celebrity, right? Michael J. Fox, or the recent passing of Eric Dane for ALS, right? These are known peoples that can raise advocacy and awareness. And this is at the supposed detriment to, let's say, more stigmatized or poorly linked or poorly understood illnesses, right? So nonprofits, far from being like this, also neutral, right? They provide safety valve sort of relief while supervising populations through case management, or normalizing austerity, right? By outsourcing public responsibility to charity, like the Bill Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, any fucking foundation you can think of that's philanthropic, right? Um, the more structural roots, right? Like like capitalist labor demands, or deregulated pollution or something like that, get sidelined for biomedical needs, right? And so there exists real barriers to community, like actual community, right? Um, a real community is a conscious association, right? Um, that control shared life conditions. We don't see ourselves as um, separate from the life process, right? Whereas under the state and the illusory community, you do, because you have to fight for that. You say, well, no, I'm actually part of this group of people who now need to have um, advocacies on my behalf, right? To basically turn us all into beggars. And what this does is it it's narrowing claims to illness specific fixes, okay, and ignoring sort of like this cross disability to class or even race or ecology or gender or whatever you want to call it, but more importantly, even beyond like this bullshit intersectionality stuff, right? It rewards isolation, right? It rewards sort of this like privatization of of mass action, right? um and so how do you move to like towards a real community then, right? Well, it's very difficult, because what you find is that most people are appealing to the very illusory community that they need to be destroying and bringing down, because this is where they get they think they're going to solve their problems. Oh, we just need to um, get in touch with the right person. right? I remember people were very hopeful that Kennedy was going to um, change something at the HHS, right? Like that's a very flimsy fucking hope. It's a very shitty strategy just to like hope this guy does right by you. You know, he doesn't give a shit. Why should he? Right? He does what the administration wants him to do. He just doesn't just act on his own behalf any more than anyone else does. And so the very simple solution is the solution that is probably the least palatable, which is that like you have to dissolve a lot of these organizations, right? It's the same thing I would say to my communist friends, right? It's like you pretty much have to dissolve your organization, right? Or form a super one, like an enormous one, the only one that people should listen to, right? If that were the case, I would say the same thing. Anyone who's a dissident should be against the state. They're the illusory community. They're the ones at this point standing in the way of the kinds of things that we want to actually achieve, which is to have more biomedical research, right? But people can't see that because everything to them is mediated by federal funding or labor, right, or capital. And so unmediated social existence is a big problem for people, right? But that's where real community actually begins. And so like I do want to like go to like some things on Twitter, for example, right? And again, this is not to call anyone out. I don't really know any of these people. I don't care about them. But like it's like, so for example, like this guy's a Canadian, I guess, and he's talking about like, oh, please sign House of Commons petition E70 whatever 76 calling for stronger federal action on long COVID, including national standards for care, research, and meaningful disability support. Won't go anywhere. And even if it did, wouldn't matter, right? Because what's the same thing, right? He's in competition with other people, other illnesses. Same thing with Long COVID Awareness Day. They're in competition with every other fucking awareness day for an illness. Lupus, MS, fucking anything you can think of, cancer, every variety of cancer, no less. Okay. And so, and even then, this is just anecdotal stuff. Like he's talking about how he's taken, I think Paxlovid or something like that, and he's talking about how it worked for him. So of course he wants funding into Paxlovid, and it's fine to want those things, but it's like, again, it's specific to him, right? Again, this is the isolating factor, right? Again, yeah, everything else is absolute waste of time, resources, and lives. Pathogen persistence is the most evidence-supported mechanism we have, etc. Right? So to him, that's where all the resources should go into, right? And by this he means funding, right? This is another person. He's starting a long COVID 5013C. Again, just aiding and abetting the illusory community, right? This is another person who is like believes that MECFS people take our limited grant money to create and publish trash that very dishonestly psychologize people with long COVID, right? And so, okay, fine, then end this fucking funneling of grant money. Then they think if they just get that grant money into the right hands, it's going to work. No, all it does is reconstitute the very illusory community that they're appealing to, right? And cannot seem to make any inroads on. It's just the same thing over and over again, and I've seen it with communists as well, right? Yeah, again, say put all their eggs into antivirals and monoclonal antibodies or something like that, right? And he's replying to the FDA head here, okay? And this person's again angry at CFS for gaslighting the suffering of others. This person wants again trials on antivirals, etc., and so forth. Okay, and if I go up here, you'll see. Yeah, this is Eric Johnson. This is a guy who's just endlessly bitching and complaining about like, oh, there's no good doctors, and the CDC didn't look into my specific Tahoe case, and it's just like, well, I don't know what to tell you, right? This is someone actually I do know, Brad, who's like, angry at that this person receives more money, right? And because he's just more known, right? And then the Open Medicine Foundation is a known entity that receives a lot of funding because they just have better awareness, right? And they're and again, he's also angry at this person who they see as like a sick influencer or whatever they're calling them or something like that, right? And again, it's all about sort of like this. It's this. It's this dissatisfaction with that there isn't enough somehow to go around, right? Because these people are encroaching on it, right? And I can't get well because of that, right? And I understand that frustration, but it doesn't solve anything, right? Now they who knows, maybe there's be some philanthropist who's just like, well, yeah, I'm going to throw $30 billion at long COVID because my daughter has it or something like that. Maybe, if that's the chance you want to take or the risk you want to take, right? And I understand the limitations of advocacy for people who have these illnesses. That's not the point. Then you should be advocating and appealing to groups who are dissident, who want to bring this all down. Because at the end of this, it's all about when you bring the state down, right? There is no more who gets what, right? It's all needs based at that point, right? And then we're allowed to freely associate, right? And the example I usually give for this is something like when the pandemic occurred. Okay, so yes, there was that partial illusory community of it being coordinated by the state, but ultimately, what spurred the creation of those vaccines, whether you for them or not, is irrelevant. Is that there was existing mRNA technology, right? That all countries had sort of like access to, and if they didn't, they were given access to, right? They used a certain amount of objectified knowledge in the form of supercomputers, okay, that expedited the process, okay, especially when it came to like the trial phases, all right. And again, they had a coordinated effort because they lowered there was no more barrier to entry anymore. It was just we have to solve a problem, and countries were allowed to coordinate. So the best scientists from Turkey and Israel and Great Britain and the United States, et cetera, and so forth, were all able to collaborate on this. I mean, China was slightly different. They came up with their own, and Russia came up with their own as well. But I'm just saying, but that was their choice, okay? And so that's what I'm talking about, is that you don't have, and I'm not talking about like relying on like market dynamics or anything like that, or non-market dynamics. I'm talking about the difference between how we go about solving this problem, which sounds indirect, because there's first this barrier that we have to overcome. And you can't overcome it by just going, we need better advocacy, or we're going to start this petition, or we're going to do this or that. Like, I don't exclude those things, but it has to address, again, material reality. And that material reality is that the state runs the show right now, right? And if you want to have a fragmented, right, sort of movement, then this is what you're going to get. So you can choose the illusory community over and over again through those various avenues I discussed, or you can work towards a real one. And again, I've laid out how that you could go about doing that. And if you don't, then don't. That's all I got.